Thanks for joining us on this Church Project podcast. Church Project is a church. We're a gathering of people who love Jesus and want to know and love him more, and we love each other, and we love the mission of Jesus in this world. We want to live that out together. We're a church, and we're a project. We're an ongoing pursuit to discover what Christ originally intended for church to be. So we gather on Sundays as the early church did. We listen to teaching from the scriptures. We worship together and we pray together. The early church also met house to house throughout the week and lived in community together. So we do that as well in house churches all throughout our community. And then the early church lived out the mission of Jesus, doing good works in the name of Christ and sharing the gospel. So that's Church Project. We hope that you will find a church that preaches the gospel, that teaches the truths of scriptures, that lives out the life of Jesus together in community. Check us out online as well at churchproject.org.
My name is Dave Edwards. I'm the pastor of discipleship here at church. Everyone say hi, Dave. And it's good to be here, and we have a lot of great things going on. If this is your first time to be a Church Project, we're kind of built around three core things that we do. We do gatherings, Sunday morning gatherings here. We do house church that you heard Matt talk about. We have First Wednesday coming up. So if you've never been, this will give you a chance to meet all of the house churches. There'll be about 700-800 people here Wednesday. It's an incredible experience. And then we do one-on-one discipleship. And so we have about 100 ladies in one-on-one discipleship, 100 men and couples as well. And so, but every week, we're having people sign up that want to be discipled, and we believe that the ultimate call of being a follower of Christ is not just that we be on the taking end, but that we'd give as well, that we wouldn't just be a disciple, but we'd help others become disciples, right? And so what we need this morning is I need some men who are willing to enter into some spiritual conversations with other men. Now, by show of hands, where are the guys at? Just by show of hands, where are the men at? All right, nice. All right, so when we get done at the end of the service, when everything is over, Jay Sherlow and myself are going to be at the discipleship wall right out here in the foyer. And if you are willing to have a spiritual conversation with another man, if you're willing to if you've been a Christian for a year or more and you're willing to invest your faith in someone else, or if you'd like to have someone help you make some traction in your journey, I'm going to ask you to meet us right out there in front of the discipleship wall. And so we need both. We need some guys that say, man, I want to move forward as a disciple. And we need some men who say, man, I want to disciple other people. And so I got to tell you, man, growing up without a dad, God brought some godly men in my life that helped me to know what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. So that's what we're doing here at the church. And so I need all the guys when we get done that are open to it and we're willing to look into it to meet us right out there in the front. All right. So now today we're going to read a text out of the Psalms. If you got your Bible, flip open to Psalm 6. If you don't have a Bible, we have one of these underneath the seats, this blue Bible right here. If you don't own a Bible, consider this yours and take it with you today. If you're not used to reading the Bible, the text that I'm going to read out of today is on page 185 or 175. All right, 875 is on page 875, and I should know it. I've looked at it. All right, so page 875, Psalm 6, right-hand column. It's only 10 verses long, but it's a vital psalm to the life of our faith and how we communicate with the Lord. All right, so I want to read it before I really talk about it so you can kind of hear what's happening and hear the emotion that's in it and what's going on. Now, the Psalms, were written for Israel to use both in public worship and in private. All right, so what we're about to read was written so that individuals could know how to do what we're going to talk about, and that a body could do it as well. Right, so let's just read it so you can hear it. Ready? Psalm 6, verse 1, O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or chasten me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord. I'm pining away, which means it's not going well. All right. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are dismayed, and my soul is greatly dismayed. But you, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, rescue my soul and save me because of your loving kindness. For there is no mention of you in death, and in Sheol, who will give you thanks? I'm weary with sighing. Every night I make my bed swim. I dissolve my couch with tears. My eyes are washed away with grief and has become old because of my adversaries. It means he's cried for a really long time. All right, that's what that means. Verse 8, Depart from me, all you who do iniquity. For the Lord has heard the voice of my weeping, and the Lord has heard my supplication, and the Lord receives my prayer. And all my enemies will be ashamed and greatly dismayed, and they shall turn back, and they will suddenly be ashamed. Now, let me tell you why this psalm matters. This is the first of 7 psalms that are called the Psalms of Lament, right? A lament was a deep cry. It means to cry out. Now, I don't know if we have any note takers here, but I like principles and points. Let me give you a definition for what it means to cry. A cry out to God is a fervent expression of faith in God, along with an absolute trust in His goodness and His power to act on behalf of me, right? A cry is a fervent expression of faith, along with belief in the goodness of God and His power to act in my behalf, right? That is a cry, right? That is a lament. Right? If I was going to put this in a little easier term to understand, I would call it how to throw a fit, right? David knew how to throw a fit in such a way that it would connect heaven into his circumstances. Now, every one of us here, we all want better communication. There's not one of us who wouldn't like to be able to communicate better with our spouse or our kids or our coworkers. Well, why should it be any different with the Lord? Right? Often our communication with God is so limited, right? Our understanding of prayer and what we use it for is so narrow that a lot of times we don't really get the full expression out. And so if there was a way that we could learn how to throw a fit in the presence of God, what that would do for us is that it would increase our hope in the Lord, right? It would help us to know that what concerns us concerns Him, right? It would give us an understanding of the goodness of God, that there's some advantages to knowing how to cry out, right? And so this morning, this is what I want to talk about. I want to show you how to throw a fit in the presence of God. Now, I know we're a nation of whiners and complainers, right? That's just how it is. Everyone likes to whine. I was on a flight that was full of whiners and complainers. I was with the seat I was in, had a child behind me that was whining because his mom didn't have the food that he wanted. Now, I have to say, I don't understand that, right? Growing up, I grew up in a single parent home. You know what the choices were for me? Do you want to eat? And that was it. That was it. Yes or no, right? You don't get to choose macaroni or cheese or peanut butter. Would you like to starve or stay alive, right? That's how it was. I mean, that was the choices, right? And this kid was like kicking the back of my seat, which is just, death on a cracker. And he's kicking the back of my seat like that. And I took it for as long as I could. And I stood up and I said, he'll fit in the overhead. And, right, he's still small enough. Now you can see why I'm single, and does not play well with others really. And then when we landed and we're getting off the plane, there was a guy that was a few years in front of me who hated the flight. It was upset about the flight and was verbal about the fact that he hated the flight and was letting everyone know that he hated the flight. I have to say, you know what a good flight for me is? Making it and landing, really. And if you haven't flown in a while, all airlines go through this safety mantra before the flight takes off, and it's very polite, kind of nice words, but they're basically telling you what to do in case the plane becomes a convertible. And that's what they're saying. They're not using those words, but it's a little safety deal, right? And I'm sitting in my row and listening to the flight attendant go on about the little safety instruction. And she says, in case of a water landing, your seat cushion can be used as a flotation device. Now, let me just say, if I'm on a plane that's being hurled at the ground 600 miles an hour, my seat cushion is going to be used as a toilet. And someone else can float after I'm done with it. I'm like, I'm finished. You want it? I don't want it. And, right. But so I had the whining kid behind me. I had the upset guy in front of me who hated the flight. And I have to say, neither one of those are examples of Psalm 6, right? Throwing a fit in the presence of God is not complaining. It's not criticizing. It's not condemning. It's a fervent cry. It's a fervent expression of our faith in God and His goodness to use His power to move in a circumstance on our behalf. That is what a lament or a cry is. And what's interesting about this aspect of crying out to the Lord is that every time a cry is mentioned in Scripture, it never goes unanswered. It's interesting. When Israel cried out, David cried out, there was a lot of people that cried out to the Lord. Every time they cried out, it was always answered, even in the Psalms, right? Psalms 34 says, and this poor man cried, and you heard, and you delivered him from all his troubles. That seems to be the rhythm, that when God's people cry out, God responds. Well, if there was a way that you could throw a fit in the presence of God that would move God into your circumstance, wouldn't you want to know about that? Right? This is what makes Psalm 6 so important, is that it gives us a structure for what happens when we cry out. It shows us how to throw a fit in the presence of God, right? It's really what I call the lost art of crying out. And so I know some people are freaked out about formulas, like you can't use formulas with God. This is not a formula. This is an anatomy. Like if we were to take the cry of David and say that in one act when he cries out, what's happening in that moment? Right? It's the same way if you watch someone, hit a golf ball, you dissect their swing, you go, what are they doing in that moment, right? That makes it so effective. It's the same thing with a cry. We're saying when David cries out in this psalm, he's laying out a structure for us to know how to do it. It's the reason why this psalm has no date and it contains no specific real circumstances. See, there's no prayer, there's no real confession or sin, or it's vague because it's meant to be used by all of us, right? This psalm is designed in such a way so that it gives us a pattern to know how to express this pressure that we're under in life. It shows us how to cry out. And so for every one of us who rolled in here this morning, that we're facing things that are beyond your ability to understand, you need this psalm. Because this psalm gives us a structure, it gives us a grid by which to know what to do when we're crying out. And so if you're a note taker and you got something to write on, something to write with, I'm going to ask you to write this down. If you have a good memory, good luck. All right, and I hope that works out for you. All right, so here we go. Right, how do we cry out in the presence of God? Number one, ready? Number one, we have to admit our hurt. We have to admit our hurt. We have to admit that we're facing a situation in which we're hurt. A lot of people will not do it, right? They won't cop to it. They won't be honest with themselves. They won't tell anybody. They're like, I got this. I can work it out. But this is what David's doing. He's admitting that he's in over his head. Now, look at this. Ready? Let me read these words and listen to these words in that light. Ready? So he's admitting his hurt. Now, look at this. Verse 1. Oh, Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger. Right? Well, so far, there's nothing in David's life to be rebuked for. Right? Now, look at this. Nor chase me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I'm pining away. He's like, my life is under pressure. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are dismayed, and my soul is greatly dismayed. Like he's talked about being chastened and being rebuked, and his body hurts and his soul hurts. Look how he describes the depth of his hurt. Verse 6, look at this. I'm weary with sighing. Every night I make my bed and swim. I dissolve my couch with tears, and my eyes have wasted away with grief. It has become old because of my adversaries. He's like, I'm all cried out. Whatever was pressing down on David, he was able to get himself together enough that he could go through his day. He got up, had breakfast, went and did all the things that kings do, right? Sign edicts and make rules or whatever, and make leadership decisions. And then he would have lunch, and then he would make more decisions. But there was something in that day that there was a vagueness to David. His decision-making skills weren't as sharp as they used to be. It wasn't quite on point. And he would finish out the day and have dinner and have meetings and go back home and throw himself on his couch to weep again. I bet we got some people in the house that you know what it's like to be able to hold it together for 8 hours. Maybe you can get through a work day. By the time you get back home, you fall apart. I bet we got some ladies here that know what it's like to put on makeup before you leave the house and then cry it all off before you get to work and put it all back on before you walk into the office building. And David is saying, I'm in a world of hurt. And he can't make any sense out of it. So he says, God, don't rebuke me and don't chase me. But maybe that's not the problem. God, then I'm in dismay. It's confusing. Right? This is what happens to all of us when we're in the midst of something that's pressing down on us that we can't figure out. We start to ask all kind of questions like, why is this happening? Did I not pray enough? Did I not read enough? Is it my fault? Is God mad at me? Is he punishing me? Is he trying to teach me a lesson? And the point is, what difference does it make? All that really matters in this moment is that God would get into the situation. A lot of people, they get stuck because they're trying to figure out, they're trying to learn. I'm not supposed to learn a lesson from being in this pain. And the truth is, man, none of us can really discover the point of the pain until we go through it. Doesn't really matter why what is happening is happening. All that really matters is that God would get into it, right? David is saying, I've been driven to the limits of my pain, to the point that I can't cry anymore. That when I do, there no tears come out of my eye ducts. And man, I throw myself on the couch, I hurl myself on the bed, and I can't do it anymore. And let me tell you why that matters this morning. Because it's at that limit where the cry is born. When you realize that you're out of resources and you can't fix it yourself, that's where a cry is born. When you realize that you're out of options and you can't figure it out and you can't fix it, it's in that place that a lament is born. You see it? And I wonder if we got some people that have been pushed to the brink in the circumstances of their life, and you're there because God's trying to get a cry out of you. It's in that place that the lament is born. If you're out of options and out of resources, you're in the right place. This is how you throw a fit. You got to start by admitting that you're hurt and that it's beyond your control. See it? Not only that, but number two, not only do we have to admit that we're hurt, but we have to apply honesty. We have to apply honesty. David gets honest with God. Now, here's the thing about David is that David knew how to be honest without being irreverent. Right? A lot of us, we don't know that. Our society is like one big collective small claims court. I mean, we don't like something, we throw a fit, we walk out. Right? David knew how to maintain reverence and still be totally honest with God. And here's how we know he was reverent. Right? If you look at this, in the first 5 verses, right? In the first 4 verses, he uses the word Lord 4 times. Look at this, ready? 5 times. Look at this. Oh Lord, verse 1. Be gracious to me, O Lord. Verse 2, you see it? Last line in verse 2. Heal me, O Lord. Right? Verse 4, look at this. O Lord. Verse 3, but you, O Lord. You see it? 5 times in 4 verses, he addresses God as a God of covenant. That word Lord means a God that he's in relationship with. But then look how it shifts. Ready? Now watch this. Ready? The last line in verse 3. Look at this line. But you, O Lord, dash, how long? Right? It's an incomplete sentence. It contains no verb. It's choppy. Right? Listen to how it reads again. But you, comma, O Lord, how long? Right? You know what he's doing? He's crying out at this moment. Sometimes a cry doesn't have a lot of words. Sometimes when you cry out, all you can do is get out, God. For some of us, you know what it's like to wake up and your whole prayer is, oh God, right? I mean, that's it, right? And in that moment, it's a cry. David is living in the dash. This is where most of us live, right? Look at it. But you, comma, oh Lord, dash. It's in that place. You're like, God, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to ask for what I need to get through this. All I know is that I need you, right? He addresses God as you. He moves from formal to informal. Because in a moment of a cry, this is no time to be fake with God, and it's no time to be formal. And so he addresses God and he says, oh Lord, you God, you got to get into this situation. I don't know how to pray. I don't know exactly what to say. I'm not even sure what the problem is. I just know that only you can fix it, so you're going to have to get into it. You see it? Now, let me tell you why this is such a big deal. If you have a relationship with Jesus, then that relationship can bear weight. You can put pressure on your relationship with the Lord, right? If you've given your life to Christ, then there are these moments in our life where you can apply extreme honesty, where you can bear down and say, God, we've walked together for a while. You know that I love you. You know that I know that you're Lord. You know that I'm in covenant with you, but I need to speak to you. I just need you. Without all the titles, I need you to get into this situation. And I know to even say that, to refer to God as you, it seems wrong, right? You feel like, man, that just seems, this is one of the scandalous things about this psalm is that David breaks with all this formality and just addresses God as the you. And it would be wrong if we only had a relationship with God in categories. If we only know God as omniscient and omnipresent, right? If we only know God according to titles and categories, then it would be wrong. But David is not using the word Lord in a categorical term here. This is the word Lord for covenant. It means that he is a God of relationship. It means that he is a God who doesn't just dwell in categories. He doesn't just dwell in some unapproachable place, but that he enters into the circumstances of our life. I wonder this morning if you had the courage to cry out. I wonder if you got the courage to say, you, God, you got to get into this situation. I can't do it without you. Right? I think we're guilty a lot of times of what I call over-polite idolatry. You know what that is? It is that we're like, well, I don't want to tick God off. We see God as too delicate and too weak, and that if we ever really get honest, that somehow he's going to fire back some Old Testament wrath at us. And so a lot of people, they stay on the perimeter, right? They just know God as a God of categories. They just know him in terms of titles, and they think, but he's too fragile, and I might tick him off with that kind of honesty. I might tick him off with that kind of request, so I'm just going to stay back over here and keep things formal. But listen to me. God is stronger. God is able, and is able to take your request, and able to hear your cry, and able to take our honesty. There has to be a moment where we apply some extreme honesty and to say, God, I don't know all the words. I don't know all the titles. I just know that I need you in this situation. Do you have enough courage to apply some honesty to your cry? We can't stay on the periphery. We can't just flirt with God and think, well, he's too far away and he might be too upset with me. Well, instead, he's big enough. He's strong enough. He's able enough to take on the things that concern us. Do you have enough courage to cry out to him? Right? And when we get in these moments where we live in the dash, where we live between, but you, oh Lord, dash, we get in that moment, we don't know what to say. And we don't really know how to describe our situation. And all we know is that we need God. I want to read something to you that should give you a little assurance that God's in the struggle with you. Listen to what this says about how we cry out. In the same way, this is Romans 8. In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness. For when we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep, cries. When we don't always say, we're like, God, my family, my marriage, I don't even know how to express what's going on. Some of us got some kids that are prodigals, and man, you've lost your kids, and nothing will break a heart of a parent like a kid that's away from the Lord. And when you don't know what to say, the Spirit of Jesus prays with you. Right? He intercedes with groanings too deep for words. He also searches the hearts and knows the minds of the Spirit because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. The one who searches our heart shares our struggles. He's in this with you. Do you have enough courage to lean into your relationship with the Lord and put a little honesty on it, put a little pressure on it? David is calling God into the situation and saying, God, I love you, but you got to get into this deal because without you, I'm not going to make it. See it? You got to admit you're hurt. You got to apply some honesty. Number 3, you have to ask for help. You have to ask for help. And this is what he does. Right? Look at this. Verses 4 and 5. He asked God for help. Now, once again, David knew how to ask for help. Not once in this psalm does David ever entertain the thought of quitting on God. Man, a lot of people, they're like, I prayed, it didn't work, I quit. Right? Now, I asked him once, nothing changed, so I quit. It didn't happen as fast as I wanted, so I'm done. Right? David never even thinks about not asking God for help. Right? He never thinks, well, hey, God's going to do what he wants to do. After all, isn't he sovereign? Right? Instead, he keeps talking. He just keeps talking. He's like, God, this is a relationship, right? You have a lot to say. I have a lot to say, right? You have demands that you've placed on me. I have some demands I'm going to place on you. This is radical, daring, bold speech of trust, right? Not once does David ever think of not asking God to get into a situation instead, but he knew what to say, right? And once again, we all had tendency, when we throw a fit, we think like victims. It's not my fault. I don't deserve this. We whine instead of cry out. David knew how to ask God for help. And it's right here in these verses. Now look at this. Ready? There's three verbs. Look at it. Ready? Return. See verse 4? Return, O Lord. Look at it. Rescue my soul. Save me. Right? Return, rescue, save. Each one of those things is something that David uses to make his cry known to God. So David doesn't say, God, I don't deserve this. God, hey, I'm innocent. He doesn't plead on his merits. He doesn't cry out based on the fact that he's a victim. Instead, and he talks about three things. If you're taking notes, if you want to know how to ask for help in terms of crying out, here's what David does. Ready? When he says, God, return to me, he appeals to God's reputation in the past. He's like, God, you remember the time when Israel was caught in Egypt and had been there for 450 years and they cried out to you? And it said that when they cried, you heard their cries and you sent a deliverer. God, you have a reputation for being someone who returns to your people to get them out of such terrible situations. God, remember how you acted with Israel? He appeals to God's past reputation. If we're going to cry out, we don't cry out on the basis of, hey, I'm innocent and God, you got to, I'm offended, so you got to make something right. We need to say, God, listen, remember how you acted in the past? Remember when you set Israel free and how you heard their cries? He appeals to God's past reputation. He also says, rescue me. He appeals to God's past action. God has a reputation for being a deliverer and a redeemer. He also has a resume of past action of being a rescuer. And I'm sure David would be like, God, remember on the final plague when you were trying to get Israel out of Egypt and you were going to kill the firstborn, and you said any family, right, would put the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, that you would pass over that house and you would spare that house, that you're a God of salvation, that you're a God who works on redemption. Remember how you spared the households of Israel when you did that? Remember your past action, God? Remember when Israel got free and they finally got out of Egypt and Pharaoh's realized he's lost all of his hired help, and they chased Israel down across the desert, and they came up to the Red Sea and they didn't know what to do, and they cried out at that moment, and at that moment you parted the waters and you made it wide enough for 1 million plus Israelites to walk across on dry ground. Remember when you rescued your people? God, remember your past action. You remember that time, God, after they crossed the Red Sea and Israel came to the waters of Marah, and it says they could not drink the waters of Marah for they were bitter, and you took a tree and you placed it in that waters, and it changed the character and the content of the water, and it made it sweet. Remember how you provided a way in the wilderness when there was no way? God, as you hear my cry, remember your past action. Now, to do this, you got to have a sense of history. I mean, if you're going to remind God of how he's acted, you need to know how he's acted. This is why it helps to read the Bible, right? It helps to know some of these stories about how God gets people out of jams. That's what he does. And David says, God, you're a God who rescues. You're a God who's done this in history. You've done it before. I don't doubt that you can do it in my own life. You see it? Return to me. Rescue me. And then he says, save me. Look at this. Look at this. Save me because of your loving kindness. Right? If you're taking notes, David makes his cry on the basis not of his own merit, but on the mercy of God. He doesn't cry out because he thinks he's worthy of it, because he deserves it. But he appeals to the mercy of God, and he says, God, save me because you are a God of loving kindness. Right? If you're taking notes, you may want to write this down. A lament leverages the loving kindness of God. Right? David is not really talking about his situation in this moment. As he cries out, he's saying, God, return to me, rescue me, save me because of your loving kindness, because that's what you do, because that's who you are, because you have a history of doing this for your people. This is amazing. I think this is brilliant on his behalf. Look at verse 5. For there is no mention of you in death, right? This is David's way of saying, let me just say, God, I'm worth more alive to you than I am dead, right? And if you come through for me, I'm going to worship you, right? And that's really what he's saying. He's saying, God, listen, because your past action and your reputation, this would be a really good moment for you to show yourself off. That's what he's doing. He's like, this is the right time. I'm under pressure. I can't deal with all this. And I'm crying out to you. And this would be the best time for you to show off your power, because nobody gives you props in death. Right? He's saying the graveyards aren't reaching out to you. Right? The people in the graveyards aren't worshiping you. So he says, God, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea for you to get into this situation. Right? And listen to this last line. And in hell, who will give you thanks? He's like, let me just remind you, nobody in hell is worshiping you today. Right? David is making his plea on the basis of who God is and what he's done and the fact that he has a relationship with him. Right? He appeals to God based on God's personal reputation, his past action, and his personal relationship. God, we're in this together. And because I'm loyal, because I'm following you and I'm in a relationship with you, I need you to get into this situation. You see how this works? He's asking for help. And not once does he ever doubt that God's going to do it. He's expecting God to get into the situation because that's how God has acted in the past. And the reason why these stories matter is because God's past action is always an indicator of how he's going to act in the future. This is why it helps to read some of these stories and know how God's acted. Because when you cry out, you're going to need it. You're going to need to say, God, the way that you have delivered and saved in the past, I need you to do that in this moment. Right? The anatomy of a cry is that we have to admit our hurt, apply honesty, ask for help. And then number 4, we have to amplify our hope. We have to amplify our hope. We can't just live in the depression. You can't live in, David couldn't continue just to hurl himself on his couch and cry his eyes dry and continue to fall apart every night at the end of the day. And so as he's writing this and saying, oh Lord, you got to get into this dash. You've got to get into this moment that I'm not sure exactly what to pray for. And my prayers are short and scattered and they don't make a lot of sense. But you got to get into that. How much longer do I have to deal with this? How much longer is this going to go on? God, you're going to have to get in it. And as he's writing this, something shifts in his spirit. And all of a sudden there's a change. Something happens as the result of his cry. And the closing verses of Psalm 6 are totally different than the first 7 verses. Listen to what he says. Listen to the tone and how it changes. Depart from me, all you would do iniquity. For the Lord, now look at this. The Lord has, look at this phrase, heard the voice of my weeping. He's heard my cry. I know we got some people in the house who are like, listen, I'm not a crier. I know we got some people, you don't cry at anything. You're like, you saw Old Yeller and you're like, shoot him again. And you know what I'm saying? That's, you watch Bambi, you're like, she had it coming. And, right, that's, even for me to talk about crying out, especially as a guy, you're like, I'm not that emotional, right? But this is not talking about just tears. It's talking about the cry of our heart. And that as a man, gentlemen, God can hear the cries of your heart. He can hear when you weep. He can hear it from your heart. This is not about just being emotional. But David says, you heard my cry. You heard my weeping. Right? Look at it says it again, verse 9. The Lord has heard my supplication. He heard my cry. Right? He says it again, the end of verse 9. Look at it. The Lord receives my prayer. 3 times he says, he receives. Now, those 3 things are there because it's David's way of saying, I'm confident that my cry has been heard. It's a way of showing confidence that God's heard it. He's heard it. He's received it. My cry broke through. It got through to heaven. Do you see it? This is why in the Psalms, when it talks about crying out, it's always answered by the Lord. Psalm 18 says, in my distress, I called upon the Lord and I cried to my God for help, and he heard the voice from his temple. And my cry for help before him came to his ears. Psalm 34 says, the poor man cried and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. David's saying, my cry got through. Now the question then is, how do you know? How do you know if God's heard your cry? Do you just kind of hope for the best? Well, if you're taking notes, there are three things that happen internally to someone whose cry has been heard. Ready? There are three things to look for in your own spirit. Ready? Number A, there's a new confidence. Right? The circumstances for David haven't changed. He's still sad. His enemies are still at him. History says that David's cries were so loud in the temple where he lived that it went out of the walls and that his enemies out in the streets heard it. This is why in these verses, he talks about it's become old because of my adversaries and all my enemies will be ashamed, right? That his enemies heard that David was in distress and they used it against him, right? And so David said, God, I know you've heard my cry, and my enemies have heard it, and they're trying to use it against me. Though nothing has changed outwardly, there's a new confidence inside of me. The Spirit of God who groans with me, who makes this prayer with me, assures me that I'm going to get through it. I don't even know how. I don't have any real evidence, but I got an inner confidence that tells me that I'm going to get through it, that I'm going to be okay. There's an inner confidence. B, there's an inner courage. And the things that used to make you melt, and the things that used to drain the hope out of you, all of a sudden, when you're like, my prayer got through. He heard it. He received it. He heard it. And now I got a new level of courage to get up and to face what's coming today. My fear has turned to boldness. My trouble has turned to trust. There's a level of courage, and there's a new calm. The single indicator that your prayer has been answered before circumstances change is that you've got a sense of peace. That there's something inside of you that says, I can't prove this with anything around me, but man, I got a peace inside of me that this storm is going to pass. That God's heard my cry. You can see how this kind of prayer would improve our communication with the Lord, right? Even without words, we can still cry out. Even when the pain is too great, we can still cry out. And so if you're taking notes, when we cry out to the Lord, we have the promise of God that He'll move at the right moment, in the best way, to the full extent. That when God hears our cry, it means that He'll move at the right moment, in the best possible way, and to the fullest extent. That when it comes to crying out, it's far better for us to cry out to God than it is to go around to everybody else complaining. Right? Complaining and crying are not the same thing. It's far better for us to tell God everything than to complain to everybody. So what's our hope for this? Our hope is Jesus. That Jesus entered into this world and suffered the things that we suffer. That the very entrance of Jesus into the world, Jesus is God's response to the cry of the human soul. That humanity, the Bible says eternity is set in every man's heart. That means that we know something's wrong, something's off, and we're looking for an answer. And so at the right time, God sent Jesus to live a perfect life and to die on the cross and to be raised again. That while Jesus was on this earth, that His acts of forgiveness, His acts of freedom, His acts of healing, His acts of resurrection were all responses to the cries of people. And when people cried out, heaven was moved. And where a voice cries out, where a cry is voiced, heaven is moved. And as we cry out, our circumstances have a chance to change. You got to cry out. When you don't know what to do, you got to cry out. When you're fed up, you got to cry out. When you're out of tears, you got to cry out. When you can't figure it out, you got to cry out. Because Hebrews 7 says is that Jesus is interceding for us. That we have a high priest who prays for us day and night. That your prayers aren't just going up into some categorical God, but they're being heard by a sympathetic high priest. That when we cry out, heaven is moved into our situation. You see it? Jesus. And so I said a moment ago that this Psalm 6 is a cross section. It's an anatomy of a cry. It shows us what went into a single, when David says, Lord, oh Lord, how much longer? Right? In that one act of crying, there is the admittance that he's under hurt. There is the application of honesty, right? There is an ask for help. And he amplifies the hope. And he says, God, you're my hope. I'm just going to stay focused on the fact that you're my hope, that you're praying for me day and night, that you hear my cry, and that heaven is moved into this situation. So when you look at other places in Scripture where people cried out, all these things take place. So I want to end this morning by giving you a New Testament example of Psalm 6. Ready? Matthew chapter 20 is a New Testament example of crying out. And I just want you to listen to what it says. This is Matthew chapter 20, verse 29. All right? Matthew chapter 20, verse 29. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. And 2 blind men were sitting by the road and hearing that Jesus was passing by. I want you to know this morning that Jesus is here. That right where you're sitting, the presence of God is as powerful in your seat as it was during worship. That the presence of Jesus moves up and down the aisles today, listening to our cries. Listen to this. That he heard that he was passing by, cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. God, you're a God of Jesus, you're a God of covenant, and you are also the Son of David. Have mercy on us. They're pleading not their own merit, but the mercy, right? The crowd sternly told them to be quiet, but they cried out all the more. They kept crying. When it didn't get through the first time, when someone told them it was useless and it was pointless and they shouldn't do it, they cried out again. And you may have to cry out more than once. And when it doesn't seem to work, you've got to cry out. And when people tell you that you've lost your mind, you've got to cry out. And they cried out, look at this. They cried out all the more. And Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Verse 32, look at this line. And Jesus stopped. There is a cry that makes heaven pay attention. With the crowd around him, the people pressing in on him, he heard the cries. Above all the noise, he heard the cries of those blind men. And he stopped. There is a cry that makes Jesus turn around. And when we cry out, he responds. When we cry out and say, Lord, you, oh God, how much longer? I don't know how much longer I can take it. I don't know if I can hang on much longer, but you, oh Lord, you got to get into this situation. And he said to him, Lord, look at this. And he called him and said, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Lord, we want our eyes to be open and move with compassion. Jesus stops, turns around, and hears their cries and is moved with compassion. God can take the pressure. You can apply some honesty and say, God, this is what I need. This is how I need you to get into this situation. Right? Move with compassion. Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. I wonder if we got some people that rolled in here with some silent cries. They rolled in here not knowing what to say to God, so much so that it's been a long time since maybe you've even talked to him. That you've lived in the middle of something for months or weeks and it's gone unchanged. You got to the point you're like, I don't know what to say. All I know is I just want out. I just want it. I don't even know how. I'm out of words. You, oh God, how much longer? I can't take it. And I want you to know this morning that when you cry out, Jesus turns around and is moved with compassion to answer our cries.